Okay, so I'm going to be talking about the early researchers. Google Slides does not have a narration feature, so I have made a YouTube video. So the first researcher we're going to talk about is Edmund Burke Huey, and he is sort of the father of scientifically based reading research. And he wrote The Psychology and Pedagogy of Reading. And he studied the kind of physiological processes involved with reading. He studied eye movements. He found that our eyes don't just run smoothly across a line of text. They pause and stop and fixate in certain areas. He also studied lip movement during reading. So he found that slower readers tend to move their lips while they're reading silently to themselves. And he analyzed reading speed. So he found that reading speed varies between individuals, which is kind of different from the prescribed fluency norms that we use in our classroom every day. So William Scott Gray, he also took a scientific approach to reading instruction, and he took a more teacher-centered approach because he found that soldiers in World War II were illiterate. They had a lot of issues following their orders because they couldn't read, and this interfered with their missions. So he wanted to move away from this student-centered model that you think of when you hear unfoldment theory. So instead of individualized lessons, he developed identical lessons meant to be taught to the group as a whole. And he developed the first teacher manuals with instructional advice to go along with these materials. So he authored the famous Dick and Jane books, and these books were different because they're basal readers, so their passages are more focused on the difficulty of the words as opposed to incorporating selections from literature. May Hill Arbuthnot, she helped him write the Dick and Jane readers. She was a kindergarten teacher. She spent a lot of time in early education. She was the director of kindergarten programs. So she valued preschool education, and she was dedicated to bringing children and books together. And her most famous work is her Children and Books textbook meant for college students. So E.L. Thorndike is one of our behaviorists. So he sort of built on to Pavlov's ideas about classical conditioning, and his contribution to the field of behaviorism is connectionism. So he studied the effects of the stimuli that occurred after behavior, and he found that behaviors that elicited rewards were more likely to be repeated than behaviors that were followed by a punishment. So the law of effect states that reward is the key to learning. He also believed that education is a habit, so it's all about forming good habits. He also opposed unfoldment theory, and he believed that learning tasks should be taught in a carefully ordered sequence, skills should be practiced and drilled, and progress should be frequently monitored by standardized tests. Sounds familiar. So he put a big emphasis on measurement and quantification. So when you think about data-based or data-driven instruction, he is a big founder of that idea. So we conquer the facts of nature when we observe and experiment upon them, and when we help measure them, we have made them our servants. And he helped lay the foundation for B.F. Skinner's work in behaviorism. So B.F. Skinner, he studied operant conditioning. So operant conditioning is also known as scheduled learning or program learning, and it breaks the learning process into chunks, like we see in a lot of direct instruction programs. And he dealt with what he called the schedule of reinforcement. So the schedule of reinforcement is a process where the behavior is sort of slowly refined, and then expectations increase as students master new skills and behaviors. And a good example of this would be when you teach your students new centers at the beginning of the year. So maybe the first time you let them go on their own, you can expect to help them 3 or 4 times during the center. And then the next time, maybe you only have to help them once or twice. And then eventually they're doing things independently. So Arthur Gates was drawn to Thorndike's work, and he was an experimental psychologist, also a behaviorist. He studied emergent reading and writing skills and worked with struggling students and students with disabilities. So he used a lot of diagnostic tests to create remedial programs for these individuals that were struggling. He also promoted the idea of reading readiness, which means that students should have a level of phonemic awareness before they start learning phonics. And he believed that sight words should be incorporated as you introduce the letters. So sight words and grapheme should be taught together. He also developed some of the first basal readers and believed that extensive practice is key. And while he developed these basal reading programs, he believed that they should only represent a small portion of instruction. So they shouldn't be the only thing that teachers rely on. And today, a lot of teachers of young students, K through 2 students, we use those basal reader phonics programs, but we also have literacy centers, and we give the students there's a degree of choice that goes into the reading materials that they get to look at on a daily basis. So Jean Chall, again, another proponent of systematic direct instruction, and she was interested in struggling readers and preventing them from failing at reading. She studied the readability of texts, and this is important because we know that we're supposed to work within our student zone of proximal development. So we have to know the level of that text, and we need to know what our students are capable of so we can match the reader to the text. We don't want it to be too difficult, or they would be at the frustration level. We don't want it to be too easy either, so we want it to fall right in that instructional zone. She believed that phonics instruction was superior to whole word instruction. So instead of students just memorizing entire words and learning to read that way, she focused on teaching the graphemes and the phonemes and learning to sound out words. She also believed in explicit teaching over discovery-based learning. She believed that children first learn to read. So K through 2nd and 3rd grade, they're doing mostly decoding. They're sounding out words, they're doing phonics, and then in the older grades, they're introduced to those more difficult texts where they have to gain meaning from them. They're not simply just reading them out loud. And something I found that was interesting is that she was a consultant for Sesame Street and Between the Lions. And if you've worked with young children, you've probably watched these programs or shown clips of them to your class at some point. So Noam Chomsky, he is the father of modern linguistics, and his ideas are very different from all the behaviorists that we just talked about. He believes in the innateness of language. So he was a big critic of B.F. Skinner because he thinks that humans do not need to be trained to speak. They are born knowing the basic grammatical structures. This is called universal grammar. So we have those categories already in our head, nouns, verbs, etc. We don't necessarily need to be trained to speak in these sentences. We just need to learn the words so we can fill in those categories. And he justifies this because he says that we can understand sentences we've never heard before and say things that we haven't been explicitly taught. So there is something innate within us that helps us learn language.